Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
Well, this week we're both going to discuss some of what we think are perhaps under-discussed themes of the Burnham transition, of Andy Burnham becoming Prime Minister earlier on this week. So, Richard, why don't you kick us off?
Yes, so I just wanted to first reflect on some of the policy initiatives that Andy Burnham has already announced or is anticipated to be exploring, and to reflect on those in light of Burnham's record as being very strongly supportive of devolution and the European Union. Because in my view, actually, a lot of the early policy wins of Burnham, both ones that have already been announced or could be announced, are incompatible with a rigidly dogmatic support of EU membership and integration, and also an opposition to central authority. So let's talk about first the policies that Burnham has already announced. One of these was that Burnham is going to set VAT on household energy at 0%. This is not a massive change to people's costs of living, but it will be a savings to people's household finances. Now, this is something that would simply not be allowed had Britain remained in the European Union, because under the EU, VAT is set at various levels specified by the EU as certain minimums based on the goods that are being sold. And for energy, the EU has a minimum of 5% VAT on household energy. And actually, this was one of the objections that Labour Eurosceptics made in the 1960s and 70s against going in the common market, was a fear that if we went into the common market, that we would be required to put taxes on various consumables that otherwise had been zero rated in Britain. When we joined the common market, household energy was zero rated, and it remained so until the 1990s, because there was this sort of a system where you could grandfather in your previous ratings. But the major government put up VAT on energy, and once they did, while we remained in the EU, we were not allowed to put it back down to the 0%. So that's a clear example of where Burnham has been able to make an announcement that would not be the case if we remained in his beloved European Union. Now, another policy announcement that Andy Burnham has made is that he is going to reduce the costs of bus fare in England to £2 wherever you are in England. I applaud this policy. It's actually a policy that I should acknowledge was first brought in by the Conservatives, but it's not a policy very consistent with belief in devolution and decentralization. This is very much an example of what I believe in, which is central government legislating or prescribing a policy that applies to everyone in the country, or at least in this case in England, no matter where they live, no matter who is in control of their local authority. But I just don't see how that squares with Andy Burnham's belief in devolving power in a radical shake-up. You know, if, let's say, a reform council, and there are quite a few of them now in this country, didn't like buses and didn't like bus users and thought, well, actually, what we really want to do is disincentivize bus usage. We would prefer that people got in their cars. Well, they could decide to make a minimum bus fare of £10, basically to drive out people's use of the buses if they wanted to. Now, I don't like that policy, but if you are dogmatically in favour of decentralising power, taking power away from Westminster, taking power away from the ability of the Prime Minister to make some proclamation as to what the costs of buses should be in Cornwall versus what the costs of buses should be in Lincoln, then it doesn't really stack up. A third announcement that Andy Burnham has made is he pledged on the front of Downing Street that he was going to end homelessness in Britain. A very laudable goal, and one that I hope that he is successful in. Homelessness, of course, is a very complicated subject, and there are various reasons why people are sleeping rough. But it's undeniable that one of the reasons why people sleep rough in this country is because they are not legally entitled to the housing services that already exist, where councils do have a responsibility to house people who are experiencing homelessness, unless that person is not legally in the country. And so it is the case that there are people sleeping rough in Britain who are sleeping rough because they are not legally entitled to those services because they're not legally in the country. And so one way to address that, of course, is to remove those people who are not legally in the country. Now, that's not something that a local government can do. It's one of the reasons why Andy Burnham was unsuccessful in ending homelessness in Manchester, even though he pledged to do so, because we don't give mayors and local authorities the ability to deport people. That's, of course, a responsibility of the Home Office. And so I assume that Andy Burnham is now seeing that if he actually wants to achieve his zero rough sleeping pledge, then one of the instruments that he will have to do that is to make use, again, of central government powers, i.e. using the Home Office to deport people who are not legally entitled to be in this country. Now, those are the policies that he has announced. There are also a couple of areas where very soon Burnham will be facing major policy dilemmas. And again, I think some of the attractive policy solutions to him run against his professed enamorment with the EU and with devolution. So one of these is water and the nationalization of water. For the last 30 so years in this country, we have had the woeful experiment of privatization of water, which has not led to, in my view, better services. And it was the kind of public utility that should never have been privatized in the first place. And one of the private water companies, Thames Water, is on the brink of going bust. And there's much discussion as to whether the Burnham government might consider nationalizing Thames Water. I hope they do, but the Burnham government might find that even if they do nationalize water, they might find some challenges at the European level or emanating from the European level. Because the BBC recently reported, quote, sources to the creditors, that's of Thames Water, have told the BBC that in the event of full nationalisation, they would pursue payment in full of outstanding debts, which would leave the government with a multi-billion-pound bill. Now, this is a rather curious thing because nationalisation, I would assume, would require primary legislation. In that primary legislation, the government would name the terms of compensation for both investors and creditors to Thames Water. Now, under the theory of parliamentary sovereignty, whatever Parliament legislates is ipso facto constitutional. There is no further legal recourse you can have to an Act of Parliament. In other words, if this is what Parliament has said is the law, you can't go to someone else and they will tell you that that's not in fact the law. The one exception to that in our system, now that we're out of the EU, is the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, which is integrated into British law through the Human Rights Act, but is also an obligation of our membership of the ECHR, which predates the Human Rights Act. And under the ECHR, individuals are able to sue governments to say that what the government has legislated to do is inconsistent with the ECHR. And this indeed was one of the great hesitations that the Attlee government had about signing on to the convention back in the early 1950s. And the Attlee government only finally did agree to sign the ECHR after the ECHR had removed the protection of the right to private property, because the Attlee government was quite aware that the way that the National Health Service had been formed, which involved the government appropriating, nationalising, taking into ownership the estates, endowments and property of the voluntary hospitals around the country and conferring them to the British state with little to no compensation would likely have fallen afoul of the ECHR. In other words, if the ECHR had existed a few years earlier, then the Attlee government may have found it more difficult to create the NHS as it did. Now, unfortunately, from my perspective, uh, of course, Labour lost the 1951 election, and the Churchill government that came in then was quite happy to add a protocol to the ECHR, the first protocol of the ECHR, which incorporates these private property rights. All of that is to say that it's really because of our membership in the ECHR that these investors and creditors of Thames Water think it's even a legal possibility that they could take the government to court over primary legislation to nationalise. This is what happened, actually, to the Callaghan government after the Callaghan government nationalised shipbuilding, and the owners of the various shipbuilding companies and their investors sued the British government in Strasbourg over the terms of compensation. Now, in that case, the Strasbourg court said that the terms of compensation were acceptable, only just. And there was basically a bit of a warning shot that was put in there where they said governments effectively can't name the price of compensation. They have to be reasonable terms of compensation. Well, this runs against the whole theory of parliamentary sovereignty. In my view, if a Labour government wants to nationalise a water company and pay its investors and creditors £1, well, people may argue against that on economic or political grounds, but as a legal matter, they should be entitled to do so. And the final policy challenge that I think the Burnham government will face, or ought to face, is the crisis of social care in this country, a long-standing and unresolved crisis. Now, this, to me, is an example of where belief in further decentralisation doesn't make much sense. As Lee will know, being a county councillor, social care is quite often the largest budget expense that English councils have to confront. It takes up an enormous share of council spending. And councils really struggle to meet the needs of their local communities, and it also crowds out the abilities of councils to be involved in other areas of spending. And so, in my view, what we should see in response to the crisis of social care is not more devolution, but is centralisation. In other words, I believe that social care should be taken out of the hands of local government and made a national government responsibility. People should not get different types of social care based on which council area they live in. And I think that a bold Labour government with a large majority might want to look at the example of the formation of the National Health Service, where when the National Health Service came into being, healthcare was in part provided by local authorities. And what did Nye Bevan and the Attlee government do? It nationalised the municipal hospitals and took them into public ownership. And I think that there would be a strong case for the creation of a national care service that would do something similar. But again, that's an example of centralisation, and again, it may be something that runs counter to some of the principles of the ECHR. So I hope that Andy Burnham in government continues to pursue some of the good policies that he has already announced, and I hope in doing so he'll quickly realise that he needs to drop his infatuation with the dogmatism of decentralisation and support for the EU and the ECHR.
Well, you're right to focus, I think, on the fact that Burnham has started his premiership with this raft of announcements. Well, some of them properly announced, some of them kind of briefed out somewhat about what it is that he's going to do differently. A few thoughts on that. One of them is a general beef, actually, that the Commons is not sitting at the moment. So last week, the Commons rose for the summer recess and now won't sit again until September. I actually think it's absurd that we're having fiscal announcements made basically by the Prime Minister or by press release and not in the House of Commons. If Burnham has come in as PM and wants to make some initial radical announcements of how he'll be different, perfectly reasonable thing for a government to want to do, then he should be in the House of Commons doing it. As it happens, the Conservative leader of the House of Lords, Lord True, had a vote and tried to get a debate on the government's agenda in the House of Lords, which Labour voted against, and the Lib Dems backed them in voting against it and not having scrutiny of the government's agenda. So there's a general scrutiny and accountability problem, I think, going on here. And it is, in fact, a theme of what the Conservatives are now starting to talk about. So Kemi Badenoch has tweeted this week that the government has talked about cutting energy bills, lifting the personal tax allowance, not announced, but sort of suggested, nationalising Thames Water, as Richard discussed, a council house programme, the biggest potentially since the war, giving mayors more funding, a national care service, which again Richard touched upon, more overseas aid, cutting student loan repayments, more employment support, ending homelessness. All of these ideas are being floated right now by a government where the Prime Minister or ministers aren't in the House of Commons, or where actually when he gives speeches, the Prime Minister in recent weeks hasn't even taken questions from journalists. There is a bit of a problem here, I think, going on about the way in which this government approaches things. But fundamentally, what does Andy Burnham know, which Keir Starmer didn't? And Burnham knows this in his bones, I think, is that you become popular through action, not process. So whilst Burnham has often tried to define himself in recent years about the process changes that he believes in, about more devolution, he's flirted in the past with proportional representation. He's flirted in the past with being much closer to the European Union and spoken about how he thinks we should ultimately be in there. Notwithstanding what Richard said about how he's governing so far, these are things that he's spoken about in the past. They're all processes rather than outcomes. But he knows, I think, as a very long-standing politician, a career politician, in fact, that you don't become popular just by doing those things. You actually have to do things of substance. And in fact, I think on a firm announcement we've had so far, you can just see how different he is to Keir Starmer. When Keir Starmer was insisting on the digital ID program, and Andy Burnham knows that you'd be much more popular for giving people, yes, a relatively small, but some tax relief on their energy bills than you are on insisting on doing a digital ID project. And Burnham just knows which of those is going to be more popular with the country and has pivoted rapidly towards doing it. And so in that sense, if Labour MPs wanted, and I think it's pretty obvious that they did, a more politically astute leader, well, they've got it. I was interested in one of the things you said about rough sleeping. You seem to imply that one of the ways in which the Labour government will be achieving their goal to end homelessness within the decade is by deporting some of the people who are currently sleeping rough on the streets, but who are not legally entitled to be here. It'd be interesting to see if a government spokesperson or the Prime Minister himself stands up and agrees with that, because the way it was reported, and actively the way in which Andy Burnham has wanted this to be seen, is that ending homelessness is a very cuddly thing to do, where we're being more generous and benevolent towards people who are currently sleeping on the streets in this country. The response to that policy has not been to assume that there will now be vans going around Oxford Street in London, checking whether people are legally entitled to be in this country, and if not, sticking them on planes. Now, for what it's worth, I think people who are in this country illegally should be deported, and that should apply if they're on the streets, just as it should if they're working illegally or whatever. But it'd be interesting to see whether or not, given how many Labour MPs seem delighted by this policy that they thought was very warm and cuddly, actually agree that that is the way in which this should happen. The Thames water point is interesting. I mean, I don't know if I ever said this on the podcast. I think my thought on this predates us doing the podcast. But I felt that when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, after that miserable time of the brief Liz Truss misrule and the Conservative vote share being appalling, I thought that the Conservatives needed a way to try and jolt the country into thinking that, right, this guy is different and this government is rather different too. And I actually thought back then that one of the ways in which Sunak should have done that would have been to announce the nationalisation of water companies. Water companies are staggeringly unpopular with the country, and it's because they're an appalling, shambolic mess. You know, if you live, as Richard and I do, in Oxfordshire, you're subject to Thames water with sky-high bills, sewage in the rivers, leaks all over the county. I mean, it's a scandal, really. My contempt for Thames water and the way it's been run basically knows no bounds. And even a Tory grump like me will be cheering Andy Burnham on if he decides to actually go to war with the water companies, because they have been party to an appalling mistreatment of their own assets, their own customers, and ultimately, I think, the entire country. And just as I thought a Tory leader could make people think more favourably of them by going after the water companies, I think Andy Burnham could as well. Because one of the things that I think we've lacked in politics in recent years is the full knowledge from our prime ministers and political leaders that actually sometimes you need to have a fight. You know, you need to know who you're for, but also who you're against. Many of our most successful prime ministers have been able to frame things in that way. And Keir Starmer, for example, never really had a very good idea, in my view, who he was for or who he was against. It was all a bit of a muddle. I think Burnham will be much clearer on that. And if one of the people he's against are the water companies, then I think that's good news for him.
There's some really good points you've raised there, Lee, and some points that I might want to push back on a little bit. So the first one is about the Commons not sitting at the moment when Andy Burnham has become Prime Minister and is making his announcements. I agree that's regrettable that the Commons isn't sitting when we have a new Prime Minister and a substantially changed government as a result of that. However, I think that's mostly unavoidable because of the timetable when Andy Burnham came in as Prime Minister. I think it's probably an overreaction to call for the recall of Parliament. I do think MPs are entitled to have a bit of a break, and I think August is a very reasonable time for them to have that break. It used to be the case, of course, that MPs would leave in the middle of July and not return until early October after the conference seasons were over. And it was only in the last 10, 15 years, certainly since I've been an adult, where MPs come back after the August recess, sit for a couple of weeks, and then go off to the party conferences again. So they will be back at the start of September, and there will be opportunities to hold the government to account. And also at that point, some of the details of those policies may be a bit clearer at that time.
I'm not begrudging an MP a holiday, but what I am begrudging is the fact that we have fiscal announcements that are being made just out of number 10. It's a long-standing convention, yes, admittedly honoured more in the breach than in compliance with it, that major announcements should be made first to the House of Commons. And there's just no attempt from this government at all to suggest that that should be the case. And importantly, therefore, no ability for the Leader of the Opposition, for the Shadow Chancellor, for the Leader of the other parties to be able to stand up and question what this is. We basically have a zero accountability government until September the 1st, which is being very active in policy announcements.
Well, that is just, again, that's not by design by Andy Burnham. That is just a consequence of the fact that Andy Burnham became Prime Minister at the end of July and Parliament was off. It wasn't something that he had orchestrated. I don't really think Andy Burnham could have himself moved any quicker in becoming Prime Minister after the local elections in May, because he had to win a seat to become an MP and fulfill all of those other tasks. So I think it's a shame, but I don't think it's something that really can be rightfully criticised, that Andy Burnham can be rightly criticised for. The people I do think can be criticised for on this are the Liberal Democrats. I do think it is rather peculiar that the Liberal Democrats voted against the main opposition to use what was a slightly longer period of sitting in the House of Lords to try to attempt to do a bit of scrutiny of the government in the Lords, which is not obviously ideal, but it's probably better than nothing. And personally, I don't have a problem with that having happened this week. I know that Labour obviously voted against the motion, the Lib Dems voted with Labour, but it's one thing for the government to do that. It's another thing for the Lib Dems to try and shield the government from criticism, but it just goes to show you how spineless the Lib Dems can be. Another point that you made, which I think is a really good point, and a point I agree with, is your point about that Andy Burnham knows that you become popular through action, not through process. And this is one of the hopes that I have for the Burnham government contra the Starmer government. I've often thought that where the Labour Party has become dogmatic in recent years, particularly curiously dogmatic on Europe, curiously dogmatic on devolution, policy areas that the Labour Party historically used to take the opposite position to where the party has become so rigidly dogmatic on. I always used to think that these were opposition indulgences. It was attractive for Labour in opposition to look to the EU or to look to central government as a way of tying the hands of Tory governments that they didn't like. And so although they claimed that they believed in the EU or they believed in devolution as a point of principle, they never really did. They were saying it because they didn't like Tory governments and they wanted to weaken Tory governments. My hope had been that when Labour came into power, the elixir of power would soon cure Labour MPs of these delusions and realise that actually having a strong central state is a really important way of delivering a socialist policy programme. What I hadn't fully anticipated, although I did anticipate this a bit, was just how dogmatic Keir Starmer and his acolytes were on this, such that they put process above all else rather than the achievement of socialist policy goals. Now, my hope is that Andy Burnham is actually more flexible on these procedural points than he's made out while he's been in opposition and when he's been the mayor of Manchester. And actually, what Andy Burnham really cares about isn't process, but is actually improving people's lives. And he understands the way that he improves people's lives is not just to always run to Brussels or Strasbourg or to Manchester, but actually to use the policy powers that he has invested in him. On homelessness, you slightly challenged me on that. I mean, now, my understanding on this issue, which, as I said, and I accept is a complex, difficult, and of course tragic issue as well, is that as a baseline in Britain, and this has been the case now for decades, local authorities have a responsibility to find housing for people who have no means of housing themselves. There are exceptions to that. One of those exceptions is people who decline the housing support that's offered to them. And I know from Labour councillors who care very passionately about homelessness in parts of the country that have high homelessness numbers, who I know and have known over the years, one of their challenges is that there are people who live on the streets who decline the support that the council is desperately trying to offer them to house them, and those councils really struggle with those individuals. Often these are people who are facing substantial substance abuse problems in particular. Now, one potential policy response to that is to do what we did in COVID, which is to remove their ability, in effect, to decline the council offer of support and basically to make that compulsory. That's quite heavy-handed, and I know that some people will really blanch at that. But if you're really serious about a zero homelessness strategy in Britain, then you have to start to think about whether some people are entered into treatment and rehab programs that perhaps they might otherwise decline, but as a way of trying to support them in these very difficult situations. It's not a very liberal policy, but it is a policy that would surely have a greater effect on reducing homelessness than a liberal homelessness policy would. And the other side of this, and again, it's not a liberal approach to homelessness, but it's actually, I think, a more effective approach to this, is that we have people who are not entitled to that council support because they are not entitled to be in the country at all. And so, of course, another approach to reducing homelessness in this country is to remove people who are in this country illegally. And you say that you don't think the Labour government will do this. Well, time will tell. I have great belief that Shabana Mahmood understands the importance of national borders. She understands the importance of the rule of law, of ensuring that people who are in this country are legally entitled to do so. That's fair not just for people born in this country, but it's actually fair for immigrants to this country who come through the legal process and through legal means as well. It's not fair on them to have to go through what's often quite a difficult, lengthy, and expensive process just for other people to enter illegally. And then finally, on Thames Water, I do very much agree with you that this is something where I hope that the Burnham government will pick a fight with the water companies. Now, I know that when I sometimes raise this, people, particularly on the right, will say to me, well, you can't just name your price. What about the investors and the creditors? They deserve their due compensation, and this compensation will cost the government billions and billions of pounds, so nationalisation is too expensive. No, I'm sorry. The government isn't legally entitled, in my view, to name the terms of its compensation. Now, it should try, I think, to name as just and fair a set of terms of compensation as it sees appropriate, but ultimately this has to be weighed against other considerations. And if creditors and investors are somewhat shortchanged, at least in the view of those people, well, I'm sorry, but that's the way things go sometimes. And that's true when you, in the private market as well, when you invest in a company and it goes bust, you might not get all your money back. Even if you lend to a company and that goes bust, okay, they may sell off some of their assets, but you may not get the full amount that you lent to that company. Now, people say, well, that will mean that creditors will put up interest rates higher next time. Well, maybe they will, but that is the case in the private market as well. But maybe these creditors and investors should not have been so foolhardy in the first place. So I have very little sympathy for them. And I think if Andy Burnham goes against them, then, okay, there will be a few people on the right who will be crying their crocodile tears over this. But I think most of the country will be on the side of the Burnham government. So I say be brave on nationalisation. Go for it. If you're challenged under the ECHR, well, then you need to start thinking about the next steps there. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Lee, what is your matter of interest?
Well, one of my criticisms of Burnham generally is that I think he's a practitioner of what I think of as low impact gimmickry. His obsession with wearing T-shirts has maybe become one of the defining aspects of that. The way his people were briefing that he won't be wearing a shirt and tie unless he's in the House of Commons, etc. It's clearly there to try and signal that he's not just another suited and booted politician, but really more fool people who fall for it, because he's obviously a long-standing, experienced career politician. But he's trying to dress like a bloke in the pub, and it's just part of his branding. But there's lots of this sort of gimmickry, I think, with Andy Burnham, because somebody quoted as a Burnham ally said to the press the other day, "Number 10 North is going to be big. International prime ministers and presidents, I think they will be invited to visit him in Manchester, not in London. It will be like Donald Trump and Mar-a-Lago. Number 10 North will be Andy Burnham's Mar-a-Lago. It will be quite radical." The thing I wanted to push back against is actually how radical is this? The assumption of that briefing from an ally is that previously international visitors and foreign heads of state and prime ministers had been just invited to London, to Buckingham Palace, to Number 10, to the Palace of Westminster. And of course, it's pretty common that they do. But the implication of that statement writes out the enormous number of times when international visitors go to parts of the UK other than London, which, by the way, is a very, very good thing. We should show off much more of the country to foreign heads of government and heads of state. Just to try and illustrate this point, I wanted to look at where American presidents, since the first one to come here as a sitting president, Woodrow Wilson, visited in 1918, the places that they've chosen to visit outside of London, just to show how normal, in fact, it is, rather than irregular. So in 1918, Woodrow Wilson visited Carlisle, where I believe parts of his family were from.
Yes, his mother was from Carlisle, and that puts Woodrow Wilson and Donald Trump in the same camp as both being presidents who had mums born in the United Kingdom.
But he also went to Manchester on that same trip more than a century ago. In 1945, Truman went to Plymouth, where he met with the King. In 1959, as part of Eisenhower's visit, he went to Balmoral, one of the monarch's private houses in Scotland. In 1963, Howell Macmillan invited John F. Kennedy to go to Birch Grove, his private house in Sussex, and he went to a Catholic church when he was there too. In 1969, Nixon went to Suffolk. 1977, Carter went to Newcastle. You could go on and on and on. Clinton, who was a very regular visitor to the United Kingdom as president, he went to Cambridge and Portsmouth and Oxford and Londonderry, Belfast, Birmingham, Weston-under-Lizard, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in Staffordshire, and also back to Northern Ireland. And finally, in his last year as president, he went to Coventry. Now, you can go on with George W. Bush going to County Durham and elsewhere too. And that's just American presidents. Other heads of government from other countries have gone to different places other than London. So President Xi, when David Cameron invited him to go to a pub in Oxfordshire. Now, this is quite a common thing to do. I missed out as well from that list times when people have gone to Chequers in Buckinghamshire or to Windsor Castle, which is in Berkshire, as part of visits and seeing the royal family. Most recently, Trump himself was in Windsor. So the idea that there's something radical about inviting foreign leaders somewhere other than London is just daft and without credibility. It takes a 30-second Google to prove how there's nothing novel about it at all. But actually, what I think Burnham is proposing with the idea of inviting leaders to his Number 10 North HQ is actually worse than what's happened before when we've taken heads of government to other parts of the UK, partly because it would be more restrictive, but actually because the building that's proposed to be the interim Number 10 North, Heron House in the centre of Manchester, is a pretty drab-looking 2019 office block. It's being used by GCHQ, part of the intelligence service, as part of their office in central Manchester. Now, if Burnham wants to take foreign leaders to places in Manchester Actually, it'd be one of the worst places he could take them. He could take them just down the road to the John Rylands Library, this late Victorian Grade 1 listed tremendous library that now belongs to the University of Manchester. He could borrow that and take them there and have meetings with them there instead. If he wanted to take them to a grand country house just a little south of Manchester, there's a place called Lyme Park near Macclesfield. It's the largest house in Cheshire. I think it's either late 16th or 17th century. It's what was used as Pemberley, so Mr. Darcy's home in the 1995 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice that the BBC did, the one with Colin Firth. All of which is to say it's a perfectly good thing to take world leaders out of the capital and to show them other parts of the UK and to meet them there. And it's a perfectly good thing that lots of former prime ministers have done. It's why very often when we've hosted the G8 or when we've hosted NATO summits, etc., we've not done them in London. Joe Biden went to Cornwall as part of a summit when he was president. It's not novel. And if the novelty that Andy Burnham is trying to do is to take them to this number 10 North, then the building that it's initially expected to occupy will actually be one of the least exciting parts of not just Manchester or the northwest of England, but the entire United Kingdom to take them to, and would not be showing Britain at its best.
First thing I want to say in response is on gimmickry. I understand that sometimes it can be annoying, frustrating, particularly for those of us who follow politics closely and follow the individuals in politics, to feel that they are sometimes making cheap gestures to the public. But on the other hand, I would defend a lot of that as just being a very good politician, which is what I think Andy Burnham is. I look back at the history of the Labour Party and think about who was a Labour Prime Minister that was often accused of cheap gimmickry. Well, Harold Wilson, one of the most successful Labour Prime Ministers there ever was. There were people who used to claim that Harold Wilson's professed love of Spam and Branston Pickle, his use of a pipe, his wearing of a Gannex raincoat was all cheap gimmickry, and that actually Wilson liked finer food, that he smoked cigars, and then that he liked to wear tailored clothes. There might have been a bit of gimmickry there. I actually think that some of that's unfair. This idea that Wilson smoked a pipe in public but a cigar in private is slightly misleading. He smoked a pipe during the day and a cigar at night, as is quite common for people who like to do that. So I gather. So that's why that happened. But undoubtedly, there was an element of Wilson playing up to this idea that he was a normal Yorkshireman, and he would talk about being a Yorkshireman all the time. And I know, Lee, that's been a source of frustration for you, given that Harold Wilson, by the time he was 16, left Yorkshire and never returned, and that he went to sixth form, not in Yorkshire, but on the Wirral, in fact, at your alma mater, Wirral Grammar School for Boys, and that as an adult, Wilson spent much more time in Lancashire, given that he was a Lancashire MP, than he ever did in Yorkshire. Nonetheless, that doesn't really matter. Those complaints don't really matter, except for points of historical accuracy, because Harold Wilson was actually really quite good at conveying the idea that he was a man of the people, a normal Yorkshireman who happened to have ended up as Prime Minister. And so I don't love the idea that Andy Burnham dresses down as some kind of signal of being an ordinary person. I don't think that wearing a suit in this day and age, where you can get a suit from Primark, my suit's from Primark, I've had it for quite some time now, it's stood the test of time, is really quite affordable to do. It's often cheaper to get a suit from Primark than to wear some of the shirts, I'm sure, that Andy Burnham and other people who performatively dress in that way spend on their clothes. Nonetheless, there is something into this day and age where dressing down conveys something of not being an elitist or part of the elite. And if Andy Burnham is able to convey that message somewhat, then I don't begrudge him for that. That's good politics. Ultimately, Burnham wants to be popular. He wants the Labour Party to be popular because he wants the Labour government to achieve the things that he wants it to achieve. And so do I. So I look past that.
Interesting is that detour back to how old Wilson was. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is just an individual's branding. And that might be enough to make them prime minister. It was enough to make Andy Burnham prime minister. It was enough to make Keir Starmer prime minister, actually, in that Keir Starmer had this branding of being a serious, hardworking, diligent person. And that was what got him into power after the disorder of recent Tory years in government. But it's not actually enough to govern. Your brand can't replace actually having the ability to govern well. And Starmer was found out. And basically, Burnham has to put more meat on the bones than just, wearing a T-shirt, talking about how much he likes New Order and talking up Number 10 North all the time. These things in and of themselves won't add up to much. There's got to be much more beside that. But I do accept your point that all politicians do branding, and it's part of a good politician to do branding in that way. And Wilson was a good example of it. At some stage, we should come back and debate Wilson, though, and his legacy, because I think one of Wilson's great failings was the fact that, yes, he did the branding well, he did the holding the party together well, he did being a likable politician very well, and he did winning elections pretty well. But if you ask people now to think, aside from holding the party together and remaining in power, what is Wilson's legacy? What do they remember him for? I don't think people have very much to say at all, with the occasional exception of the social reforms that happened at that time, with which he was actually not particularly closely associated, and which also happened in pretty much the rest of the world at the same time. So were not standout things that you would pin on the door of that Labour government as such.
Well, Wilson cited his greatest achievement being the Open University, which is still with us today. I don't disagree that you can't just have gimmickry, but having a good image is not inconsistent with also having a good government. And sometimes, actually, in order to be able to govern, you need to be able to get the permission to govern. And one of the ways you get the permission to govern is for people to like you in the first place. So I actually think it's a good thing that Burnham is doing. On the more substantive side of your matter of interest, which is on Number 10 North, first of all, I was pulling my hair out when I read this story in The Sun about the ally of Andy Burnham briefing that Number 10 North would be Andy Burnham's Mar-a-Lago. This is really quite radical. And I just thought to myself, has this person never heard of Chequers? I mean, since Ramsay MacDonald, Labour prime ministers have made use of Chequers as a place to get out of London and to invite visiting heads of government and heads of state. I mean, Ramsay MacDonald in the first Labour government in the summer of 1924 invites Edouard Herriot, the Prime Minister of France, to stay with him in Chequers to talk about what they called the new Entente Cordiale. He invited the what was called at that time the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, the head of the devolved government of Northern Ireland, and the leader of the Irish Free State to Chequers in 1924 to bring them together for meetings. The idea that prime ministers just invite world leaders to 10 Downing Street is a bizarre insinuation. And Chequers is actually really important from the perspective of the Labour Party, because one of the reasons why Lloyd George took Chequers was because he was anticipating that in the future you would have more men and one day women of more humble backgrounds who wouldn't be prime ministers, who would have country piles. I mean, what had been the case in the past is that it was very common for prime ministers to spend some of the week in London and some of the week in their country home. And even as late as, say, Asquith. Asquith used to spend half the week in London and then half the week at his home, which is called the Wharf in Sutton Courtenay in what is today Oxfordshire, not too far from where we live, but had been at that time Berkshire. And Harold Macmillan actually was sort of the last to keep up this tradition of having his country house in Sussex, where he would go on the weekends, and then he would spend the sort of working week in London. And I guess this is sort of what Andy Burnham imagines himself doing with his home in Manchester. And fair enough, good luck to him. But as Prime Minister, he already does have a ready-made massive pile to do this, to get away from London, to get a bit of a retreat, to think, to have more open and interesting conversations, both with people in his government, from around the country and around the world. And that's Chequers. And he shouldn't turn his nose up at it, especially for what I have seen are the designs of this number 10 North, which, as you say, Lee, look like some kind of horribly drab, interchangeable, soulless, modern office block, which I just don't think inspires, elevates, promotes creativity, or anything of the sort. I think it actually does the opposite. So I would advise Burnham to stay away from places like that. Get out into the country. Yes, go to maybe some of those places that you mentioned around Manchester, but for God's sake, don't coop yourself up in some kind of identikit, plasticky office block, and for God's sake, don't bring the world's leaders to that setting. It's not a good impression of our country.
That's all for this midweek episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. If you'd like to support the podcast and hear some bonus content too, you can join our Patreon. There's a link for that in the show notes. And if you like listening to the podcast, we'd be thrilled if you left us a positive review wherever it is you get your podcast from. Otherwise, we'll be back on Sunday with the next installment in our Summer Book Club series. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.